All right, welcome back to the channel. So, in this video, we're going to talk about Errol Spence Jr. and Floyd Mayweather Jr. and what Manny Pacquiao has to say about the two of them. Specifically, he had to say that Errol Spence Jr. has nothing to learn from Floyd Mayweather Jr. because Errol Spence Jr. is a better fighter than Floyd Mayweather Jr. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. Before we get into the subject matter of the video though, please make sure to share the video, like the video, and to subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed. It all goes to helping grow the channel. Thank you very much in advance. So let's talk about this. This is a hot topic, and I know it is going to get a bunch of comments and insults and all kind of threats and stuff around it. And that's good because it's exactly what people who are Floyd Mayweather Jr. fans, and I consider myself to be one of them kind of to a certain degree, it's kind of what you guys deserve. But Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Errol Spence Jr. and Manny Pacquiao are going to be fighting in a very, very big fight coming up at the end of August. And yesterday they had a press conference. And in the press conference, or after the press conference, there was a bunch of people in the media that asked both fighters a bunch of questions. And one of the things that was asked of Manny Pacquiao was, essentially, did you know that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is, talks to Errol Spence Jr.? And are you worried that Floyd Mayweather Jr. may give Errol Spence Jr. some tips in order to fight you? Now, what Manny Pacquiao said was, why, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, why would Errol Spence Jr. have to talk to Floyd Mayweather Jr.? Because there's nothing Floyd Mayweather Jr. could tell Errol Spence Jr. Errol Spence Jr. is already a better fighter than Floyd Mayweather Jr. is. Now, right there, I'm telling you, I love that statement. And the reason that I love that statement is because I have been saying for years that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is going to reap what he sows as far as all of the things that he said about the great fighters that came before him and pretty much disregarding their careers and what they've done because of the things that Floyd Mayweather Jr. has done. And it was only going to be it's only a matter of time before the same thing happens to Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Floyd Mayweather Jr. fans have to sit there and be insulted when a bunch of other fighters are called better than Floyd Mayweather, because only thing people are paying attention to is what happens right now. And that, I'm telling you, is if it doesn't happen with Floyd Mayweather Jr., it's going to happen with Jaron Ennis. If it doesn't happen with Jaron Ennis, it's going to happen with somebody like if Anthony Joshua had actually panned out and hadn't gotten knocked out. I'm telling you, before you start comparing yourself and dogging people in the past for what they did, just remember that it's going to happen, that it's more than likely going to happen to you, to you as well. So why exactly would, onto the subject matter of who is actually the better fighter between the two. Now, for me, I say that you should not compare fighters from two different eras, at least until the active fighter's career is done. When the active fighter's career is done, then you can make the comparison about how good these guys are, right? So, for example, I could say right now, yeah, Errol Spence Jr. is better than Floyd Mayweather Jr., but 5 fights from now, he could lose to somebody that is a journeyman or something like that. And you could say, okay, well, and then maybe like a Roy Jones Jr., right? At a certain point in time, Roy Jones Jr. was on path to be considered one of the greatest fighters of all time. But then what happens? You have the Antonio Tarver loss, and then you have the Glennoff Johnson loss. Then you have the Bernard Hopkins 2 loss. You have the Joe Calzaghe loss, and you got the several other guys that at least one other guy knocked out Roy Jones Jr., right? So all of that stuff goes by the wayside, according to a lot of people, right? So, but Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s career is complete. Now, what I will say, though, so I don't believe that you can say that right now, that Errol Spence Jr. is a better fighter than Floyd Mayweather Jr. I wouldn't say that. What I would say is that Floyd Mayweather, that Errol Spence Jr. is a better welterweight than Floyd Mayweather Jr. is. And the reason that I say that is because of the career of Floyd Mayweather Jr. at welterweight. And, you know, there's a lot of people, like I, for example, would separate the career of Floyd Mayweather Jr. into two parts. There was the pretty boy Floyd that was there up until around the time of Oscar De La Hoya, right? But then after Oscar De La Hoya and after he got that fight, he became Money Mayweather. That's when he came in there with the Mayweather blueprint, especially when he got to welterweight, and he basically ran the same routine over and over and over and over again, but yet it took for the same results over and over again. And that is, he would fight on May and or September on Cinco de Mayo and on a Mexican Independence Day, and he would fight somebody with the name. He probably only fought once a year. I think towards the end, there's a couple times he might have fought twice, but somebody with a Hispanic last name and somebody that was a flat-footed fighter, somebody moving up from a lower weight class. For example, Marcos Maidana. He fought Marcos Maidana twice. Marcos Maidana is a former 140-pounder who I do believe lost to, the guy from St. Louis whose name is skipping. I can see his face right now, but he was a young fighter from St. Louis that beat Marcos Maidana, and I think he beat Marcos Maidana as easily as Floyd Mayweather Jr. beat Marcos Maidana, but Marcos Maidana jumped up in the public's eyes because of the fact that he beat Adrian Bronner. But Marcos Maidana 2 times, Robert the Ghost Guerrero fought Manny Pacquiao, is a smaller fighter that moved up, and and Victor Ortiz is another example of somebody who's a smaller fighter that moved up and fought at that weight class, right? Even Andre Berto. Andre Berto was always a welterweight, but that is a diminutive welterweight. So I don't really think that highly of Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s tenure at welterweight, other than the very remarkable fact that he made a lot of money doing it. Right? But we're talking about what happens in the ring, not what happens outside the ring as far as the money that you're making. We're talking about fighting is fighting. Money is money. They're two different things. Floyd was definitely the best at making money, but in the ring at 147, no. When you look at what Errol Spence Jr. is doing at 147, beating Sean Porter, beating Kell Brook, beating Lamont Peterson, beating Danny Garcia. I think, and if he beats Manny Pacquiao, I think that's just a better run at welterweight. But I think it's too early in Errol Spence Jr.'s career to talk about him being a better fighter than Floyd. Now, if they're talking about in terms of technique, I mean, that really is a what and what as far as their technique. But as far as the overall talent of them, I would say that they both use their talent very, very well for the style of fighter that they are. But when I saw like the best of the best Floyd Mayweather Jr., it's the guy that was fighting at 130 pounds. That is very, very, very hard to duplicate somebody that can fight like Floyd Mayweather Jr. was fighting when he beat Diego Corrales. Because Diego Corrales was a legitimate fighter, and he really ripped him something. So anyway, that's my take on the matter. I'm telling you, I think that Errol Spence is the better welterweight because he's the bigger guy. He's the natural welterweight. But it's hard until the career passes to say that about especially with Manny Pacquiao having that sounds like a little bit of sour grapes. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.